So, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another video on Python fundamentals. Today, we will be learning about basic input and output operations in Python. So, where we left off last, right? We learned about Python literals, data types, variables, and how to perform basic arithmetic operations in Python, right? So in this video, what we'll be going through is basic input output operations. We'll continue where we left off. Remember, we wrote a script that calculated the cost of a trip, of you're going to travel somewhere using your car. And then we had the distance to the destination, or the distance traveled. We had the mileage or economy of the car in terms of rands per kilometer. And then from there, we were able to calculate the cost of the trip. However, in that situation, we were the ones who inputted the values. We hard coded those variables to get our answer. But in this video, what I'll show you is how you can create a program that asks the user to input key variables or the inputs to calculate the trip cost. And in doing so, we will learn about the input function, and then we will also learn about typecasting. Remember, we spoke about typecasting in the previous video. We spoke about data types, rather, excuse me. We spoke about data types in the previous video. And we have numeric data types, the string data type, collections, and also, what's the other one? Boolean and others, right? In this video, I'll show you how you can convert from strings to various numeric data types, and to convert between the different numeric data types, right? And then we'll write a program using the input function. All right, so let's end this presentation and get back to the coding. Okay, now we're back to our Visual Studio Code environment, and let's get to it. So remember, I said we're going to discuss the input function, all right? So we have not yet spoken about functions, but let's just remember a function basically takes an input and does some process to it, and either creates an effect or causes an effect to happen, or returns a result, right? So in this scenario, now we are dealing with the input function, and essentially what the input function is, it allows us to communicate with the computer. So when you call the input function, what happens is on the terminal, you see that the computer will wait for an input, right? So you're basically collecting an input from the terminal, if you look at where I'm typing now, and then you passing that into this function. And then remember, we can assign the value, what we entered here, into a variable by doing something like user input, right? And we do that, okay? And if we were to run that, what would happen? Let me show you. And I say print user input, and we run it, okay? Remember how we run a file in Python on the terminal? I will say Python first program.py. And it's running, as you can see. There's now the terminal is waiting for us to give an input, and I will write hello world. And I press enter. We see that it printed what we entered, hello world, and we can do that again. Okay, so it's entered, and I say hello to you too. We should see hello to you too again. So that's how the input function essentially works. So, however, if you noticed when we ran it, it's kind of, if you didn't know how the input function worked, it would be kind of confusing. You would just be looking at it and be wondering, okay, is my computer frozen? You know, because, okay, see there, okay, what does that mean? I don't know. Okay, it's just, it looks like it's frozen, but it's not. So we just enter something random and then so the input function has a parameter, something that you can write here that will display on the terminal to show you that we've entered the program, right? So I'll write, please enter an input. And then that, okay? And we'll run it again. Let's just clear our terminal, clear. Okay, and then we say that, and we see that, right? Please enter an input. So you can now see that, okay, it wants us to do something. And I'll just say, how are you? And there, it prints it out. Now, now think of the possibilities that we can do with this, right? We are essentially asking the user to input a value, and then from there we can we can manipulate that input and return something else based on what the user gave us, right? So we can write a program. So what happens when you use the input function, right? What is the data type of user input, right? So when you use the input function, whatever you put into there, whatever you write on the terminal and send to the program, gets stored as if you look there, as a string, right? That is how the input function works. Whatever you put in gets returned as a string. I'm going to call it again, and I'm going to say 15, right? That's a number to you and I, but the computer will store it as a string value. And there it is. And we could say, on the next one, we could say print. If we want to get the data type of a literal or a variable in Python, we use the type function, right? And we put in the variable that we want to get or the value that we want to ask it. And we say print the type of the user input. So you can read like this. Okay, I'm putting in user inputs and I'm asking it for the type and I want it to print it out to the terminal. So I'm going to run the program again. It says, please enter an input, and I say 15. And you see 15 is a type of string, right? So, however, what happened if you wanted to do some mathematics like we want to do later on? We want to calculate the cost of a trip, right? We can't do mathematical operations with a string value. We would need to convert this value into a numeric value. So we could do some mathematics or mathematical operations on it, right? So there are two ways to do that in Python, right? We have, that's just a multi-line string. We have implicit, right? It's implied, implicit typecasting in Python, right? Okay. So an example of this is, let's look at when we want to do a calculation with a float. Let's start with the numerics, right? So I am going to define, I'm going to define a variable of type int. And I'm going to say a is equals to 15. And just to test it now, we're going to say print the type of a. And what should that return? Well, if you have thanks to, what do you call it now? Python. If we hover over A, we will see it's a literal of 15, but I wanted to tell us it's an integer. Let's hover there, but before we, oh, okay, it's not working there. All right, so let's just run the program again, and we'll see it's a type int, okay? However, now let's say I want to convert it to a float. Well, I don't want to convert it to a float because this is implicit typecasting, right? So let's say I want to calculate something, and I'm going to calculate it with a float, right? And I say B is equals to 12.0, right? And let's say, let's make a arithmetic operation. Let's subtract. Okay, remember this is a float value because it's a decimal, right? And I say, let's say print type of B again, and we should have int and float. And that's what we have. Let's just clear our terminal again, and so that we can have a clean, all right? So now let's just do some implicit typecasting, right? I define a variable called C, and I say A minus B. And I say print C, right? And C is already telling you that C is a float, okay? But let's just do it. There. Print C. C, that is you can see that's a float value, but let's use type of C. And we get a float. So that's one method of integer or implicit typecasting. That would also work if we did a multiplication, right? And if I run this, it'll still be a big number, 12 times 50. I don't know. What's 12 times 15? You can do the math, all right? But I'm just trying to show you that that's a float, okay? Now, there's another type called explicit. Explicit type casting or conversion, whatever you want to call it, right? So in this, we want to convert from one value to another. We don't want Python to just imply it or do it automatically. We want this conversion to be done, all right? So the most common functions for that are float, int, and string, right? So what this one does, whatever you put in here, it attempts to convert it to a float. The next one is int. It attempts to convert it to a string. And I mean to an integer. And the last one attempts to convert to a string. Okay. And so I have an int variable, say A is equals to 5. So remember I had A over here and I set to 15. Now I have redefined it. Five. Essentially what happens is once the computer gets, or interpreter reads this, A is 15, gets here, is okay, well, A was 15, but now this guy has just said A is now 15. So it kicks away 15 and stores 5 for A, right? Now I want to type cast A to a float, right? So what I'll do is A float is now equals to float of A. And what that does, if we hover over a float, you'd see that it has now stored it as a float. Okay, and we can test it out just to be pedantic. A